My mom called me a slut for accidentally getting pregnant. Then the exact same thing happened to her. My mother called me from the hospital at 6:48 in the morning, and I knew before I answered what kind of call it was, because she only called that early when something had broken through the careful surface she maintained over her life. I had been awake since 5. My daughter Cora wakes early, and I have learned to simply accept this about her the way you accept weather. So I was standing at my kitchen counter in Columbus, Ohio, making oatmeal for a 3-year-old, when my mother's number appeared on my phone. I answered. She said, "I need you to know something." I said, "Okay." She said, "I'm at Riverside Methodist, I'm fine, but I need you to know that I'm pregnant." The oatmeal on the stove made a small sound. I turned it off. I stood very still for a moment and thought about every word she had said to me when I was 19 years old and sitting across from her at the kitchen table in our house in Dublin, Ohio, holding a positive test I had taken 3 times to be sure. I thought about those words, not the general sense of them, but the specific ones. The ones she had chosen from everything available to her and had deployed with the precision of a person who understood exactly what they would do. I thought about all of it in the space of about 4 seconds. Then I said, "Tell me what's happening." I need to give you the context before I give you the rest of this, because without the context, it is simply a story about irony, and it is more than that. My name is Nadia Ogundimu. I am 28 years old, which means I was 19 when I got pregnant with Cora, and 20 when she was born, which means I have been a mother for the entirety of my adult life in the way that very early parenthood makes you. It is woven into everything, the first frame of reference rather than something added to an established identity. My mother is Lorraine Ogundimu, 52 years old, a nurse practitioner with 24 years of clinical experience who runs the women's health practice at a family medicine group in Dublin, where she has worked since I was in middle school. She is, professionally, a person who talks to other women about reproductive health every day of her working life. She knows everything there is to know about bodies and choices and consequences. She is also, in her personal life, the woman who sat across from me at the kitchen table when I was 19 and said, "I raised you better than this. Girls who end up like this are girls who don't respect themselves. I'm embarrassed for you." Those were not all the words. Those were the ones I have retained most precisely because they were delivered with the specific calm of a person who means what they say. My father, Emeka Ogundimu, was different. He had been quiet and sad when I told them, sad in the way of a person who had wanted different things for their child and was grieving the particular version of the future that was no longer available. He had not been cruel. He had cried once, briefly in the hallway outside my bedroom when he thought I couldn't hear him, and that crying had broken something in me that took a long time to heal. But he had also come to every prenatal appointment I asked him to attend, had helped me apply for every assistance program available, had built the crib himself and put it in what had been the guest room when I was still living at home during the early months of Cora's life. He had been a father to me when my mother was performing disappointment. They had divorced when Cora was 18 months old, for reasons that predated my pregnancy, but which my pregnancy had apparently accelerated in some way I never fully understood. My father lived in Cincinnati now, 2 hours away, and came every other weekend and called every Sunday and was, to Cora, simply her grandpa Emeka, who brought jollof rice and played the same songs on his phone every visit and was consistent in the way that mattered. My mother and I had a functional relationship by the time of the phone call, which is the honest way to say it. Functional means she came to Cora's second birthday party and brought an appropriate gift. Functional means we spoke on the phone every 2 or 3 weeks about neutral topics. Functional means neither of us had said the words from the kitchen table conversation aloud again, had not referenced them, had built a structure of normalcy on top of them the way you build a house on a foundation you hope is solid but have not examined in years. Functional means I had never forgiven her, and we had both decided to proceed as though I had. That was the state of things when she called from Riverside Methodist at 6:48 in the morning. What she told me over 20 minutes while Cora ate her oatmeal and watched an episode of something on the tablet was this. She had been seeing a man named Gregory for about 7 months, a cardiologist at the hospital where she occasionally did continuing education work. A man who was 55 years old and divorced with adult children and who had seemed, by my mother's description, like someone she could reasonably care about. They had been careful, she said, which is a word that means something very specific when a woman with 24 years of clinical reproductive health experience uses it. Careful had not been sufficient. She had missed her period in September and had done what she professionally told other women to do, which was not to panic and to take a test, and the test had been positive, and the subsequent tests had confirmed it, and she had been processing this information for approximately 3 weeks before calling me. She was 6 weeks along. Gregory had been, in her careful word choice, not prepared for this information. Gregory was, in less careful phrasing, gone. He had not ended things formally, but had stopped calling and responding to messages with the smoothness of a man who had decided that distance was cleaner than a conversation. She was 52 years old, a trained women's health professional, recently unpartnered, pregnant with the child of a man who had stopped answering his phone. I sat in my kitchen and looked at my 3-year-old daughter eating oatmeal, and I thought, here we are. I drove to Columbus, or rather I drove to Dublin from Columbus, where I live now, which takes about 20 minutes on 161. I arranged for Cora's morning with my neighbor Fatima, who had 3 kids of her own and who covered for me in emergencies with the solidarity of a person who understood what it meant to manage childcare alone. I pulled into my mother's driveway at 9:15. She was home from the hospital by then, sitting at the kitchen table, the same chairs, the same window looking out at the same backyard, with a cup of tea she had not drunk, and the particular stillness of a person who has been holding something very heavy and has finally put it down somewhere. I sat across from her, in the specific chair I had sat in at 19. The geometry of it was not lost on either of us. She looked at the table, then she looked at me. She said, "I know what you're thinking." I said, "Tell me what you're thinking first." She took a breath. She said, "I'm thinking I owe you an apology that I should have offered years ago, and that the timing of it right now makes it look like I'm only saying it because I need something from you." I looked at her. I said, "Is that the apology, or are you setting up the apology?" She almost smiled. Almost. She said, "What I said to you when you were 19. I have thought about those words many times since I said them. I said them because I was frightened for you, and I didn't know how to be frightened without being cruel. And I took the cruelty out on you when you were already scared. That was wrong. It was wrong when I did it, and it has been wrong every day since, and I am sorry." I looked at my mother sitting at her kitchen table 9 years after the conversation that had defined so much of what we were to each other, and I felt something shift in the room. Not dissolve, not repair, but shift into something that was at least the beginning of a different shape. The practical situation my mother was in was, by any objective measure, serious. She was 52. A pregnancy at 52 carries elevated risks that she knew better than almost anyone. She talked about them with patients regularly. She had an OB/GYN appointment scheduled for the following week, but she had needed to talk to someone first, and she had called me. I found that significant. Not her sister in Michigan, not her closest friend, Beatrice, not her practice partner who had known her for 20 years. Me, because I was the one person in her life who would understand from the inside what she was holding, who had sat at the same table and faced a version of the same impossible morning, who knew what it felt like when the test results said a thing your life was not arranged to accommodate. She called me because I was the only person she knew who would not need it explained. I stayed for 3 days. I drove Cora to daycare from Dublin, which added 30 minutes each way to my morning, and came back and sat with my mother and helped her think through what she was thinking through. Not deciding, that was hers entirely, but thinking. She saw her OB, Dr. Patience Adeyemi, who had 16 years of practice and who was my mother's colleague and friend, on the Thursday of that week. I drove her. I sat in the waiting room while they talked. When my mother came out, she was quiet in a way that meant she had received information she needed to sit with. In the car, she told me Dr. Adeyemi had reviewed her health history and the relevant risk factors, and had given her a clear-eyed assessment of what the options were, and what each one meant medically and practically. She said Dr. Adeyemi had been, in her words, completely non-judgmental in a way that made me understand what I had never been to you. I did not say anything to that. I drove. My mother decided to continue the pregnancy. That decision was hers, and I am not going to editorialize about it because it was not mine to editorialize about, which is something I understood from having had a decision of my own treated as available for public editorial when it was not. What I did, practically, was help her think through what the next months would look like. Gregory had, at this point, confirmed via a brief text message that he was not in a position to be involved, which was the kind of sentence that communicates a great deal about a person's character in a very small number of words. My mother forwarded me the text at 11 at night, and I looked at it and thought about Cora's father, who was a man named Dele, who had been 21 when Cora was conceived, who had not handled it well initially, but who had, over 3 years, grown into something approximating a present and reliable co-parent. Not what I had hoped for at 19, but more than Gregory, whoever he was apparently prepared to offer my mother at 52. Gregory's full name was Gregory Ashford. He was, as noted, a cardiologist. He worked at the same hospital system where my mother did continuing education. This overlap was practically a problem. Not insurmountable, but real. My mother had a family law attorney she had used during her divorce from my father, a woman named Constance Idowu, who had 18 years of family law practice and who my mother reached out to in November to understand what her options were regarding paternity and support. Constance had reviewed the situation and told my mother, in her direct attorney's voice, that she had the right to pursue paternity establishment and child support regardless of Gregory's stated preferences, that his not being in a position to be involved had no legal bearing on his financial obligations, and that the process would begin with voluntary acknowledgement and escalate from there if necessary. My mother was not a woman who had ever needed financial support from anyone. She had not, initially, been planning to pursue it. But Constance made a point that I thought about for a long time afterward. She said, "This isn't about whether you need the money. It's about whether your child has the right to acknowledgement from both parents. That's a different question. My mother sat with that for a week and then told Constance to proceed. What happened over the following months was a gradual, layered disclosure. The process by which a private situation becomes known to the people around you, whether you plan for it or not, and the process by which those people reveal themselves through how they receive the information. My mother's practice partner, Dr. Seun Adeyemi, no relation to the OB, a different Adeyemi, a GP who had worked alongside my mother for 11 years, was supportive in a way that surprised her, which told me my mother had expected judgment from a colleague and had received warmth instead, which reconfigured something in her understanding of what she had given me when I needed it. The women at her church, which she attended regularly and which I had grown up in and left when I moved out, were more varied in their responses. Some warm, some carefully neutral, one or two conspicuously silent in a way that communicated their opinion without requiring them to voice it. My mother bore all of it with a steadiness I had not seen from her before, a steadiness that I thought was related to something that had shifted in her after our conversation at the kitchen table. The crisis point, and there was one, because these stories always have one, came in February, when my mother was 22 weeks along, and Gregory Ashford decided that the pending paternity and support process was incompatible with his preferred version of events, and engaged his own attorney, a man named Terrence Bassey with 20 years of family law practice, to challenge the timeline of the pregnancy and imply, through legal filings that became semi-public through the hospital's administrative grapevine, that my mother's account of the relationship and its timing was not accurate. This was, to use a clinical term, a lie. It was a lie with specific intent, to muddy the legal waters enough to delay or reduce his financial obligations, and possibly to protect his professional reputation at the hospital from the narrative of a cardiologist who had declined to support a pregnancy he was responsible for. The filing landed on Constance Adou's desk on a Wednesday morning, and she called my mother and then called me, because I had been added to the file as an emergency contact. She described the filing in the flat legal terminology of someone who had seen this tactic before and was neither surprised nor impressed. She said, "He's trying to create enough ambiguity to slow the process and possibly settle at a lower number. It's not uncommon. It's also not going to work because the documentation your mother has is significantly more comprehensive than he's accounting for." My mother had documentation because she was, professionally, a meticulous woman. She had text message records from Gregory spanning 7 months. She had appointment records with date-specific references that established the timeline. She had, crucially, a voicemail he had left her in August, before he knew about the pregnancy, before everything changed, in which he had been warm and specific about plans they had made, and which established, beyond any reasonable question, both the timing and the nature of the relationship. Constance called this voicemail, in the understated language of lawyers, who have found exactly what they needed, highly material. She had it transcribed, dated, and logged as Exhibit C in the case file. I sat with my mother when Constance walked them through the documentation strategy, and watched my mother hold herself very still and straight, while her attorney described how her own careful record-keeping had built a case that Gregory Ashford's strategy could not reasonably overcome. Gregory's attorney made a second filing in March that attempted to challenge the paternity timeline using a medical expert whose analysis Constance described as selective in ways that any competent opposing expert will take apart in about 20 minutes. Constance engaged Dr. Miriam Osei, a reproductive medicine specialist with 27 years of clinical experience, to review the timeline documentation and provide a counter-analysis. Dr. Osei's report, submitted as Exhibit F, was 12 pages and was described by Constance as comprehensive and unambiguous. Gregory Ashford's attorney stopped filing challenges within 2 weeks of receiving it. The paternity acknowledgement was completed in April. The support calculation process moved forward. Gregory's professional reputation at the hospital had, by this point, sustained the kind of quiet damage that happens in professional communities when word circulates, not in formal channels, not as official proceedings, but as knowledge that people have and carry. He requested a transfer to the hospital system's facility in another part of the state in May. The request was granted. He left. My mother's lawyer emailed her the final support order on a Friday afternoon, and my mother forwarded it to me with no message attached, just the document. I want to tell you about the day my daughter met her grandmother as a real grandmother, which is different from the functional version. And when I say real, I mean present in the way that matters. Cora was 3.5 when my mother's son was born. My half-brother, I suppose, though that phrasing feels inadequate for whatever he actually is in the network of relationships that constitutes our family. His name is Tobias. He was born in June, healthy, after a pregnancy that Dr. Adeyemi had monitored with the attentiveness that elevated risk pregnancies require. I was in the waiting room when he was born, the same way my father had been in the waiting room when I was born, though I did not know that detail until my mother told me years later, and it hit me with the delayed force of information that means more in retrospect than it would have in the moment. I brought Cora to meet Tobias when he was 4 days old. She stood at the side of the bassinet and looked at him with the serious, evaluating expression of a child encountering something new and significant. She said, "He's small." My mother said, "You were small once too." Cora considered this. She said, "Can I hold him?" My mother looked at me. I looked at my mother. Something passed between us that was too complicated to name, and also simple enough that it did not need naming. I said, "Let Grandma show you how." That word, Grandma, was the first time Cora had used it voluntarily, without prompting, in an address rather than a reference. My mother heard it and held very still for a moment in the way of a person receiving something they had been waiting for without letting themselves admit the waiting. Then she showed Cora how to hold a newborn, arm under the head, support the weight, let him feel the warmth of your body. Cora held Tobias for about 90 seconds with the careful concentration of someone performing an important task, and then she handed him back and said she was hungry and asked if there was any food. There was food. We sat in my mother's hospital room, the three of us plus this new small person, and we ate the sandwiches I had brought. And it was ordinary in the specific way that ordinary things are when they arrive after a long period of nothing ordinary being available. My mother and I are not the same as we were before the kitchen table conversation, and we are not the same as we were during the years of functional equilibrium, and we are not yet whatever we are going to be eventually. We are in the middle of a thing, which is where most real relationships live. Not at the beginning where everything is possible, and not at the resolved end, but in the ongoing middle, where you are both the person who is hurt and the person doing the work of figuring out what to do with the hurt. I see her every Sunday now. I bring Cora. She feeds Tobias, and Cora plays in the backyard she has played in her whole life, and I drink tea at the kitchen table where so much happened and so much is still happening. My mother is 52 years old with a newborn and a complicated history and a professional life she has maintained through everything, because that is the kind of person she is.